Mic test 1 2. Test 1 2 3. Oh. Mic test 1 2. Testing 1 2 3. Can you hear me? That's good. Yeah. Oh, test 1 2 3. Mic test 1 2. Good.
Mr. Wexler is done receiving all his congratulatory hugs, I think the subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Last July, Secretary Kerry, together with negotiators from Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, announced that the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations had restarted. Here we are now, 9 months later, and what do we have? We have a peace process that fell apart, yielding no positive results, leaving both parties with an even greater distrust of one another. In fact, the legacy of this failed round of talks could be that it ended up causing more harm than good, as it seemed to have moved Fatah and Hamas closer to reconciliation, while Abu Mazen continues his push for de facto recognition at the UN, both of which will have serious repercussions for U.S. policy toward the Palestinians. There are laws on the books that prohibit U.S. assistance to any UN agency that accepts a non-existing state of Palestine amongst its ranks. And though the administration continues to seek a waiver in order to give the funding, I will continue to do everything in my power to ensure that it does not get this authority. And then there is the Palestinian Anti-Terror Act, a bill that I authored that eventually became law that prohibits U.S. assistance to a Palestinian government that would have Hamas, any members of Hamas amongst its ranks. Should reconciliation happen and Hamas become a part of the Palestinian government, I fully expect Secretary Kerry and the administration to enforce the letter of the law. I don't doubt Secretary Kerry's earnestness in wanting a mutually beneficial deal between the parties. I share that earnestness. I don't think anyone in this subcommittee would disagree. But from the beginning, I questioned the prioritization of this endeavor in light of so many other pressing matters in the Middle East and the North African region. To say that this task was one better suited for Sisyphus would be an understatement, forever pulling that rock up the hill. Secretary Kerry's faith that Abu Mazen and the PLO could sit down with Israel this time and somehow come to the table with a newfound desire to actually achieve peace with Israel was misplaced. The PA and Abu Mazen have shown time and time again that it is a corrupt entity incapable of governing the territories, unwilling to see a two-state solution in which two nations could exist side by side in peace. And so one has to question the amount of time, effort, and resources spent chasing the unattainable, at least under the present conditions, when there is one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recent history occurring in Syria, transition to democracy impediments in Egypt, and Iran continues its support for terrorism worldwide, and its nuclear ambitions have not waned. Over 150,000 people in Syria have been killed, while millions have fled to neighboring countries or have been internally displaced, and the administration's policies, undefined and indecisive, have failed to adequately address this issue. According to the State Department's recently released Global Terrorism Report, al-Qaeda and its affiliates are on the rise and becoming more aggressive in places like Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and North Africa. Iran continues to be the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, actively targeting Israeli and U.S. interests, increasing its presence in our own hemisphere and Africa, and of course, it is still propping up the Assad regime in Syria. All of this while the administration continues to negotiate with the regime in Tehran over its nuclear ambitions, even though state's own assessment is that Iran continues to refuse to prove its nuclear program is indeed for peaceful purposes. And these are just a few of the fires that need to be put out in the Middle East and North Africa region, yet the failed peace talks have managed to fan the flames. The signed reconciliation agreement between Fatah and Hamas signifies that Abu Mazen is more interested in making peace with terrorists than it is with Israel. But it reveals who Abu Mazen really is. He's a man who has never been a true partner for peace, but rather an obstacle toward peace. Abu Mazen is a man more interested in taking U.S. taxpayer money and using it to pay salaries of convicted Palestinian terrorists with Israeli and American blood on their hands than he is in running an effective government that could lay the foundations for an independent state. Abu Mazen is a man who is corrupt and uses cronyism to maintain his position as the head of the PLO and the PA, and fears losing that control, and thus will never make the hard decisions for the benefit of the Palestinian people at his expense. This hearing is important to understand how and why this latest attempt at peace between Israelis and Palestinians failed, and allows us to take a closer look at the real obstacles to peace in order to better formulate U.S. policies as it relates to the PA. And I'm now very pleased to yield to my ranking member and good friend, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today. It's a special honor for me to welcome Congressman and former Chairman of the Europe Subcommittee, Robert Wexler, back to this committee. I'll have more to say about him in a couple of minutes. Earlier this week marked Yom Ha'atzmaut, the 66th anniversary of the independence of the State of Israel. Since her independence in 1948, Israel has defended herself on every single one of her borders. Despite facing continued, even existential security threats, Israel has become a vibrant democracy, one that, unlike so many of Israel's neighbors, respects human rights and religious minorities, all while an innovative, high-tech economy flourishes. We must acknowledge that the Palestinian Authority under President Abbas has made tremendous strides in working to build state institutions and establish security forces that have dramatically reduced violence in the West Bank. The United States Congress has committed a great deal of resources to strengthening the Palestinian Authority, to the tune of $400 million per year. At the outset of peace talks last August, Secretary Kerry worked with the international community on a $4 billion economic package that would help jumpstart the Palestinian economy, because we all know that a stable state starts with a strong, thriving economy that provides greater opportunity and prosperity for the Palestinian people. For the past 9 months, the world watched as Secretary of State Kerry and his team worked feverishly to restart direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Now the April 29th deadline has come and gone without any agreed-upon framework or extension of talks, which leads to the obvious question: what happens next? What role should the United States play going forward, and what are the consequences if Fatah reconciles with Hamas? We hope to see progress in the talks. We hope to see two states for two peoples arising out of direct negotiations and without the imposition of any third-party plans. But we cannot expect Israel to continue to negotiate with a partner who has chosen to reconcile with a terrorist organization that refuses even to recognize Israel's right to exist, one that targets innocent Israeli civilians with rockets and suicide attacks. President Abbas claims that any interim government will abide by the same principles the PLO adheres to, which have been stipulated by the international community: renouncement of violence, recognition of Israel's right to exist, and the acceptance of all previous diplomatic agreements. Let's be clear. Israel will not negotiate with any Palestinian government that is backed by Hamas terrorists and refuses to accept the Quartet principles. Any government that includes Hamas terrorists will not receive U.S. assistance. The law is clear, and this Congress will not allow U.S. funding to flow to any government that includes terrorist members of Hamas. I hope this message has been received in Ramallah because, like so many of my colleagues here, I believe in U.S. assistance to the Palestinians. If we want to see a thriving, stable state for all Palestinians, economic support and foreign investment is the best way to promote peace and stability. Why would President Abbas jeopardize the world's support by partnering with terrorists? It's easy to sit back and say, we've seen this before. As we know, there have been similar failed reconciliation attempts in 2007, 2011, 2012. But the damage the Palestinians do in trying to unify with a terrorist group is that the Palestinians aren't using the time, the Palestinians aren't using their time to build their institutions and to prepare their people for peace and for the recognition of the State of Israel. Aid dollars are needed for all of those things, whether it's for security, institution building, education, or economic growth. So the bigger question is, what is Abbas doing to really make a Palestinian state viable? What's he doing to make a Palestinian state that can be stable? Instead of unifying with a terrorist organization, why not take a very positive and concrete step? Condemn violent acts of incitement. He can also prevent incitement and prepare for peace by taking a small but very significant step. Put Israel on the map, his map. Official Palestinian government maps must show Israel. That will communicate to the Palestinian people that Israel is here to stay, and that those who envision a Palestinian state, as they put it, from the river to the sea, whether they are members of Hamas or whether they are anti-Israel members of BDS groups, do not support a two-state solution, a Jewish and a Palestinian state. By changing the maps, President Abbas can show that he is committed to peace even while they are not. Now, we know the only path to a peaceful two-state solution is through negotiations between both parties. Unilateral actions will never achieve this goal, and I hope that there is still space for negotiations to continue without this unity deal. And so as Abbas stands at this very critical juncture, I urge him to choose the real partner in peace, and I yield back.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. I now would like to yield to our members for their opening statement. And we'll start with Mr. Shabbat, Subcommittee Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Unfortunately, I have another hearing that I have to attend here shortly, so I will read the testimony of all the panel members here following the hearing. But I did want to come over to personally recognize and acknowledge the presence of our former colleague, Congressman Wexler, who served this institution so honorably for so many years. And we actually served not only on Foreign Affairs Committee together, but also Judiciary Committee, and we participated in such things as the impeachment of a president. We were on opposite sides on that one. Well, I'm on everything, I stand corrected. Although we were two of the co-founders of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, so we generally agreed on issues with respect to Taiwan. I remember a number of CODELs that we were involved in, and did, I believe, good work in various parts of the world. We went to The Hague together when Israel was under such attack around the world for trying to defend itself and building a security fence in some areas, wall, and in other areas, and they were getting much criticism, and we were there speaking out on their behalf. I remember meeting with President Mubarak in his office, and when he was still in power in Egypt, and we were urging him to hold free and open and fair elections, and perhaps had he followed our advice back there, he'd find himself under different circumstances today. But in any event, I appreciated his service to this institution, and we appreciate his good work on behalf of this nation at this point in this capacity, and we welcome you back, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Higgins of New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to also welcome the panelists here, and just to take this in a little bit different direction. If you look at public polling, both the Palestinians and the Israelis, in equal numbers, 70, 80%, believe in a two-state solution. But at the same time, by those same percentages, they don't think the two-state solution is possible. So what you have is a context of disbelief. And, you know, unilateralism, one side taking a move, doesn't move us closer to any kind of solution. What you need is mutual steps here. What could the Israelis do to demonstrate to the Palestinians that they believe that the West Bank, or most of it, should be part of their state? Well, don't build outside of the blocks. You know, the blocks represent about 8% of the West Bank. You would be saying to the Palestinians, we're only going to build in the area that we think should be our state, not the area that should be your state. If a parallel move is made on the Palestinian side, what could the Palestinians do? As my colleague Ted Deutsch had said, put Israel on a map. You know, if you ask the Palestinian leaders why Israel is not on a map, they say they don't know what the borders are. Well, you know what they want them to be. So, you know, there's no website, there's no textbook that talks about, you know, the existence of Israel in a two-state scenario. The other is, as Ted also said, is stop the incitement. stop treating Palestinians that kill Israelis as martyrs. This creates a cycle of violence that transcends generations. In my tradition, in the peace process in Northern Ireland, both sides that had committed themselves for 30 years to violence on the Catholic side and the Protestant side, before they were admitted to the negotiating table, both sides had to renounce violence. Both sides had to participate in the destruction of their arms to demonstrate that they were truly committed to a peaceful coexistence. And I think what we have to accept here is that you can do all kinds of negotiations. You can try to bring the leaders together to push them in a direction that they don't want to be. But a settlement to this long-standing issue has to come from within. It's not going to come from without. And the two sides, the United States can push Israel, push the Palestinians together, but both have to come to the conclusion that, their disdain for each other historically is not nearly as important as their love for their own children in the future of a two-state solution between the Palestinians and the Israelis. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. And if the subcommittee would indulge me for just a minute, Mr. Rohrabacher, I'm going to turn to Mr. Deutsch, who's going to I'd like for him to say a few words about Mr. Wexler, and I know you have some other commitments, and I do as well, but I know that Mr. DeSantis is going to take over for me. We've got a meeting with the Syrian opposition group. So Mr. Deutsch is recognized, Mr. DeSantis, and then we'll take over.
I'm sorry that we both need to head off to other commitments, and as our witnesses know, we will pay close attention to the testimony today, both as you deliver it and written. I just wanted to take a moment to welcome my friend and my former Congressman Robert Wexler back to this committee, on which he so ably served for so many years. It is Congressman Wexler's commitment to these issues, his expertise about these issues, his deep passion not just for what happens in Washington, but for the constituents that he represented, that I now have the good fortune to represent. It is all of these things that made him a tremendous member of this body, and the way that he forged relationships with members on both sides of the aisle, as we've already seen here today, is a high bar that he set that I have spent the past number of years trying to reach. So it's wonderful to have you here. You're doing great work, Robert, in your current capacity at the S. Daniel Abraham Center. I wanted to thank you for all that you have done while you were here, all the great work that you continue to do. It's an honor for us to have you here. And I also wanted to acknowledge Danny Abraham, who's also here, who is a World War II veteran, a great American entrepreneur, and someone who has dedicated so much of his life to making peace as well. Robert, it's a pleasure to welcome you back. Danny, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the committee. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield back to you.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, recognized.
Yes, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks that were just given us about our former colleague and friend. I have been following this, as many Americans have, the possibility of having peace in the Middle East for, well, almost my whole life now. I was born in 1947, and I guess Israel was born in 1948. I do not believe that this is a problem where, at least it isn't anymore, where you have two sides that are unwilling to try to reach out to one another. What we have is Israel in the last 20 years has given up territory, has reached out, has in fact given up the West Bank, and has permitted total of the Gaza Strip to go into under the jurisdiction of the Palestinians. And I see that in the last 20 years, 30 years, we've seen Israel give up a lot. And I haven't seen the Palestinians give up anything. And what have they given up in the last 20 years? The only thing that stands today between peace in the Middle East, as far as I can see, and I'd be anxious to hear your reaction to this, the only real thing that stands between peace is a Palestinian willingness to say, we don't have the right to return to the pre-67 borders. Thus, we do recognize Israel has a right to exist as a separate state, and we will have the two-state solution. But every time I ask a Palestinian, and I have lots of Palestinian friends, well, that means that you agree that this right of return doesn't exist, because if you say the right of return, you're saying Israel doesn't have a right to exist as an Israeli, as a Jewish state, right? And so they never will say that. To me, that's the only thing that's a roadblock. The Israelis have already made concessions. What concessions have the Palestinians made? They're not even willing to make that. I am for peace. I really am. I am not, I don't think of myself as someone in favor of Israel over the Palestinians. No, they're both groups of people who deserve to have their own country and deserve to live at peace. And, but I would hope that as we go through the testimony today, that we get to the heart of the matter. And I believe that that is the heart of the matter. The Palestinians have to agree that Israel will be able to exist. And they haven't honestly done that yet. Please feel free to contradict that in your testimony.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we'll soon hear from our witnesses, Secretary of State Kerry's efforts to broker a peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians took place in the context of great regional turmoil. History will determine whether or not the efforts were worth the effort. Our challenge in the present, however, is to assess what policies we can pursue now that will help move the prospects for peace forward, and perhaps more immediate, what policies will help ensure that the region does not move backwards. Much has been said lately of the decisions Israel must consider, particularly regarding borders, the security arrangements in the Jordan Valley, and prisoner releases. I believe the focus is myopic. Dr. Schanzer, I hope you will take the time today to elaborate on your prepared testimony on the need for Palestinians to focus, in your words, on good governance, economic reform, and institution building. Finally, I'd like to touch briefly on the recent comments of Secretary Kerry and his reference to the specter of apartheid relative to the conflict. As the Secretary later noted, he wished he would have used a different word. I appreciate his quick retraction and his candor. While Israel, like any society, is not perfect, one need only look at the Arab members of the Knesset or Salim Gibran, an Arab-Israeli judge sitting on the Supreme Court, to know that the term apartheid does not apply here. The State of Israel grants full rights and security to its Arab citizens living within Israel. Full enfranchisement, full employment, full housing, and full participation in the political process are a staple of Israeli democracy. But more important, though unintended, the use of the word apartheid gives support to those who seek to delegitimize Israel and those who promote divestment and sanctions against Israel. I hope that we can count on the Secretary and others to avoid such linkage in the future. I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes himself for 1 minute. I want to thank the witnesses for coming. This is a very important issue and near to many of our hearts. It seems to me, especially with the unity government now with Hamas and Fatah, that the single biggest obstacle, and I'll echo my colleague from California, to having a peace in this region has been the refusal of the Arabs in the region to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. There have been multiple opportunities where you could have had a Palestinian state. The original UN partition plan in the late 40s, that was way more generous to the Arab population than to the Israelis. The Israelis accepted it. The Arabs fought it. Of course, we've had multiple conflicts since then. There have been multiple opportunities for there to be a true two-state solution where Israel is existing as a Jewish state. And so until that changes, I don't see how we're going to be able to have a resolution of this in a way that benefits Israel's security. And I do not think that we can continue in good faith to be sending U.S. taxpayer dollars over to the Palestinians if they're allied with Hamas. I mean, Hamas, forget about recognizing Israel. I mean, they want to destroy Israel. They are not even bashful about their support of terrorism. And so I don't see how this is something that could be viewed as a positive step. And I think we need to act in the Congress. Good behavior can be rewarded, but I think you got to penalize bad behavior. And I will now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the Chairman and Ranking Member of the Committee for calling an important hearing. To our witnesses, thank you very much. And to Congressman Wexler, it's great to see you again. Thank you for being here. Gentlemen, I'll be brief. I think that my colleagues have framed the debate about as well as you possibly can, just to add my voice to it. Look forward to your testimony. Look forward to the opportunity for us to ask you some questions. I myself am particularly interested if, to the extent that you can speculate, as to Abbas's decision as to approach Hamas and the decision to reconcile, what the prospects for a true reconciliation there actually are, and what that means in the immediate term as that process continues to unfold for U.S. policy in the region. So thank you very much again, and look forward to your testimony.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. I, too, would like to welcome the witnesses. What I would say is that Israel has done more than any nation should have to do to try to achieve peace. They've given up their land. They've released terrorists. They've done everything they could to try to achieve peace, and the Palestinians have done nothing. One thing I would correct for the record, I think it said Israel was born in 1948. That's modern Israel. Remember, Israel has been around since 1200 BC, so Israel's been around for a very, very long time. Hope we recall that. Again, I look forward to the testimony. Thank you.
I want to thank the gentleman. So I'm pleased now to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for coming. Welcome back first, Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who's Vice President of Research for the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Prior to this, Dr. Schanzer served as a counterterrorism analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where he took part in designating numerous terrorism financiers. So welcome. We also have with us Mr. James Prince, who is co-founder and president of the Democracy Council. Prior to this, Mr. Prince was at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he was engaged in the Middle East, including through an investigation of corruption at the Palestine Investment Bank. Mr. Prince was also a senior professional staff member for this committee and helped to establish a public policy institute at a university in northern Iraq. Welcome, Mr. Prince. And last but certainly not least, we welcome back Mr. Robert Wexler, a former member of the Florida delegation, who is now president of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace. During his time in Congress and now at the center, Mr. Wexler has traveled extensively in the Middle East and was also chair of the Subcommittee on Europe of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and served on the Middle East Subcommittee as well. So welcome, Congressman Wexler. At this point, I will recognize Dr. Schanzer. You guys have 5 minutes for opening statements, and you may begin.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, distinguished members of this committee, on behalf of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I thank you for the opportunity to discuss the recent U.S. efforts to broker peace between the Palestinians and Israelis. I highlight 4 major issues of concern today. The first is the timing of the recent initiative, particularly from Israel's perspective. The existential threat posed by Iran's nuclear program, coupled with the very serious concerns over the White House's recent decision to offer sanctions relief for a mere pause in that program, has cast a pall over every other Israeli strategic decision right now. Of course, this threat should not stop America from pursuing peace, nor does it let the Israelis off the hook on its commitments for peacemaking. But I believe it was unrealistic to ask the Israelis to make meaningful security compromises until this crisis passes. For that matter, it may have been unrealistic to expect the Palestinians to deliver, while so many of their influential Sunni allies also express misgivings about Washington's judgment. They, too, are consumed with fear of an Iranian nuclear program. The second area of concern is Palestinian governance. For too long, Washington has turned a blind eye to the corrupt and ossified nature of the Palestinian Authority. Given the PA's 20-year track record of mishandling public funds, we might as well light a $600 million bonfire each year. Should our assistance to the Palestinian Authority continue, and there are some good arguments for this, it must be performance-based. To be clear, this approach is both pro-Palestinian and pro-peace. Corruption erodes the public's trust in government, and that undermines whatever deal may be reached. Conversely, A government that commands the respect of its people will earn the public's confidence to negotiate a viable solution to this conflict. A good first step would be a plan for the departure of Mahmoud Abbas. At the age of 80, he is now 9 years into a 4-year presidential term. Leader for life of the Fatah faction and the PLO, Abbas crushes political opposition and silences criticism of his leadership by arresting journalists and even Facebook users. In other words, he is an autocrat. Why our peacemakers pinned all their hopes on his leadership is still unclear to me. If we want change, it's time for new leadership. The third area of concern is the recent reconciliation agreement between the Fatah faction and Hamas. Admittedly, these two factions have tried and failed several times in the past to cement a unity deal. There is good reason to be skeptical again. But if Hamas does join either the PA or the PLO, it is a sign that Islamist terror is officially welcome. The fact that Abbas sees Hamas as even a possible partner raises troubling questions about the trajectory of the Palestinian nationalist movement today. Of course, a unity deal could also cause a complete rupture in U.S.-Palestinian ties. The inclusion in the Palestinian Authority of Hamas, a designated terrorist organization, is obviously a legal trigger for a full cut in funding. Similarly, the inclusion of Hamas in the PLO might prompt a redesignation of the PLO as a terrorist organization, and that could lead to asset freezes at home and abroad. On another note on Hamas, if we are serious about weakening this group, then pressure must be placed on two U.S. allies, Turkey and Qatar. They are among the terrorist faction's top financial and political sponsors. How they remain allies of the United States while supporting terrorist groups, and there are others beyond Hamas, might actually be a good topic for future hearings. Finally, I am troubled about the U.S. government's apparent lack of readiness to confront the so-called Palestine 194 campaign. The Palestinians have renewed their initiative at the United Nations for recognition. Never mind that the campaign is designed to spurn the U.S.-led peace process and isolate the Israelis through diplomatic lawfare. Our laws stipulate a cut in funding to any agency that accepts the PLO. This was the case of UNESCO in 2011. Will Palestinian unilateralism prompt us to cut funding to a host of multilateral organizations? If this is not our preferred outcome, should we not have a strategy to prevent this? If it is our preferred outcome, the process should not be predicated upon Mahmoud Abbas's diplomatic maneuvers. In my written testimony, I note that the PLO subsidiary, the Palestine National Fund, could be funding these unilateral efforts. Some U.S. tax dollars may be allocated to the PNF through the PA, and this could be a worthy investigation. On behalf of FDD, I thank you again for inviting me to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Shanzer. And the chair now recognizes Mr. Prince for 5 minutes. I don't know if we're getting it. Can you speak?
Is that working now?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Despite the essential conditions for peace existing on both sides, as the distinguished members of this subcommittee noted, in Secretary Kerry's Herculean efforts, the diplomatic effort has failed again. I will confine my comments to the Palestinian side of this equation. It's not meant to ignore or diminish the unique and tremendous hardships posed by the occupation, but rather to discuss the imperative of dealing with the internal dynamics and the corruption inherent in the Palestinian Authority. Since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, the U.S. has vacillated in its attention to internal Palestinian politics. Criticism of the PA leadership was often perceived as a distraction or detrimental to the peace process. The immediate need of supporting peace negotiation often pushed issues of fostering good governance, civil society to a second tier. Taking risks necessary to achieve peace, enhance the quality of life in Palestine, requires leaders with not only the courage, but also a political mandate that will support such risk-taking. Even within Mr. Abbas's inner circle, there is a consensus that Mr. Abbas does not feel he has the political mandate to take such risks, and he is not strong enough to support any negotiated agreement that he negotiates. The Abbas PA has become a single-party police state ruled by presidential decree. Debate and criticism is not tolerated. Corruption and nepotism has washed away much of the goodwill and legitimacy conferred onto the regime after Abbas succeeded Arafat. The absence of national elections following the expiration of the presidential term in 2009 further degrades the legitimacy of the PA in the eyes of its own constituents. Abbas is likely to retire in advance of the next election. This will signal an abrupt end to the Arafat era and older generation. Infighting with the Fatah Central Committee has so far precluded emergence of a consensus legacy candidate. Polls indicate that Fatah would still win over 40% of the vote, with Hamas receiving upwards of 12%. The most remarkable indicator that should be noted is that 34% of the eligible voters in the West Bank and Gaza are undecided or just don't agree with any of the current leadership. Allegations of corruption mismanagement has plagued the PA since its inception. In 1999, I helped manage an investigation into the Palestinian International Bank. We presented Yasser Arafat with massive evidence of fraud, mismanagement, and illegalities. We suggested to him that he take the report and pass it over to the appropriate law enforcement officials. He replied in very characteristic candor, "Why? The Palestinian people trust me more than they trust the Palestinian Authority or any institution." President Abbas has taken this rule by presidential decree to a whole nother level. The so-called Fayyadism and a focus on institution building not only reduced corruption, but importantly stimulated government collections in spite of a decrease in gross domestic product. For the first time during Salam Fayyad's previous tenure as finance minister, the Palestinian budget received applause. I participated in a worldwide investigation that brought back over $700 million into the Treasury and helped eliminate much of the pervasive smuggling and corruption. However, this very intermittent positive trend ended following the 2006 elections. The international response was to wall off the Ramallah from the Gaza Strip. The temporary international mechanism, followed by the Pegasus system, not only channeled cash assistance and succeeded in stabilizing the PA, but it reinvigorated an imperial presidency that Abbas has continued to this day. Except for select ministries and agencies such as the Palestinian Monetary Authority and Ministry of Education, few government offices operate to international standards. The Palestinian Investment Fund is one of the most controversial tools used by Abbas to wield influence and direct favors. As previous testimony to the subcommittee indicates, beginning in 2007, the PIF has operated largely as an extension of the presidency, directed by the chairman and CEO of the fund, who happens also to be deputy prime minister. In violation of its own charter, the PIF often directly competes against the local businesses and is a way of garnering favors with the leadership. In my written testimony, I talk about the Hamas and Fatah reconciliation and the challenges it posed. U.S. law regarding cutting off assistance to a government that includes Hamas and the Quartet's principles for recognition are clear. Without workarounds, this drastic measure should only be deployed as a last resort. I'd like to skip to some of the suggestions for USG programming that I included in my written testimony. They include avoiding large economic projects controlled by the authority, gearing more towards small business in the West Bank and Gaza with an emphasis on underserved communities. We should devote additional funding for rule of law programming. We need to dedicate additional resources to fostering independent life, political party development, independent candidate training, and independent media, so to avoid some of the missteps done by USAID and other international organizations in preparation for the 2006 elections. U.S. government assistance should also include evidence of institutional reform, such as a participatory election law that precludes candidates that advocate violence, civil service and pension reform, adding an office of vice president, and allowing the PA ministers the ability to appoint their own deputies and department heads without presidential interference. The Palestinian Authority remains the best vehicle by which to bring about a durable peace in the region. However, lacking a political mandate from its own constituency, the PA leadership will be unable and unwilling to make the difficult decisions needed to move from the status quo. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank the gentleman, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Wexler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Schneider, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the honor of allowing me to testify before a committee I truly cherish, and in the company of several dear friends who I respect enormously. Although 9 months have passed, and negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians have stalled, what was true at the start of the talks is even truer today Negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians remain in both sides' respective strategic interests. For the Palestinians, there was and still is only one reality. The route to an independent state runs through a negotiated agreement with Israel. Neither seeking admission to international institutions nor threatening to dismantle the Palestinian Authority can achieve the dignity and justice Palestinians deserve in a state of their own. For Israel, there was and still is only one reality: to secure its future as a Jewish and democratic state, a viable, independent, and yes, demilitarized Palestinian state must be realized. So what do we do now? First, it is too soon to judge the nature of the reconciliation agreement between Fatah and Hamas. There, in fact, have been similar reconciliation agreements attempts in the past that were never implemented. On Hamas, there is no debate. Hamas is a terrorist organization. No ifs, no ands, no buts. We need to appreciate, however, that the differences between Fatah and Hamas are as great as the differences between Israel and the Palestinians. Israel's actual response to the reconciliation agreement is instructive. Prime Minister Netanyahu is no dove, but he has been careful to suspend the talks with the Palestinians and not cancel them outright. And on Tuesday, Israel walked back from threats to impose sanctions on the Palestinian Authority. The Prime Minister knows that Israel is most secure when it is working in cooperation with Palestinian security forces. Just this week, Palestinian forces uncovered and arrested 4 members of a terror cell in the West Bank that was plotting to attack Israelis. Should Congress move now to defund the Palestinian Authority in response to the reconciliation agreement? When I was in your shoes, I would have been quick to make a strong political statement condemning a new Palestinian government that might include terrorists. However, if Congress defunds the Palestinian Authority and the PA cannot pay its security forces and other bills, we hand a victory to Hamas. A stated purpose of the reconciliation agreement is to conduct an election, a desperately needed election in the Palestinian territories. Should the Palestinians in fact return to the ballot box, we must bolster those Palestinians who renounce violence and recognize Israel's right to exist. Cutting off U.S. funds now will depress the Palestinian economy, increase unemployment, and clearly advantage the objectives of the extremists. How does that help us? How does that help Israel? We already have sufficient laws that prevent funding of terrorist organizations. Let those laws serve their purpose. This is not the time for hasty action. In the immediate future, we should encourage the two sides to continue to de-escalate the fraught situation and keep the window for a two-state solution open. Moreover, all is not lost. Progress was, in fact, achieved on the core issues of borders and refugees during the recent negotiations. Additionally, for the first time, the Arab League modernized the Arab Peace Initiative to accept the principle of land swaps, which would allow Israel to retain the major settlement blocks adjacent to the 1967 lines. And after working with more than 150 experts at the Pentagon, General John Allen presented an extraordinary security package that, in a two-state outcome, would include measures to make Israel's eastern border as strong as any border in the world. President Obama and Secretary Kerry deserve credit for initiating a credible process. It is now up to the two sides to build on what was achieved over the past year, or that progress will slip away. Pope John Paul said there were two possible solutions to the Arab-Israeli conflict: the realistic and the miraculous. The realistic would involve divine intervention. The miraculous, a voluntary agreement between the parties. It's America's duty to keep pushing for the miraculous. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, and we'll begin the questioning. We'll go to the gentleman from California. Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized for 5 minutes.
I like that, the miraculous. That's good. All these things like the progress that you mentioned, Bob, when the border swaps were approved, this is all just short term. They are meaningless unless there is this long-term recognition of the basic principle that's necessary to have peace, and that is for the Palestinians to say, yes, Israel will exist. We're spending $400 million a year subsidizing the Palestinians over decades while they're being intransigent the whole time. And again, I'm not sitting here rooting that the Palestinians come out losers in all of this. I think the winners are going to be Palestinians and Israelis living side by side and respecting each other's rights in a two-state solution. But do you really think the United States, if all we're seeing is the short-term gains that don't mean anything unless you have that long-term understanding, we can't do that forever, can we? Yes, Bob, that's what it.
I'm not the spokesman of the Palestinian Authority, but in 1988, the Palestinian Authority recognized Israel's right to exist. If they didn't, you wouldn't be voting to send money to the Palestinian Authority. That was a condition of American engagement with the Palestinian Authority. So what we have here, I mean, your point, though, is well taken, I think, in a different respect. And that is, should the Palestinians, in the context of the current negotiations, recognize Israel as a Jewish state, as a state in the context of mutuality of recognition? And the answer is absolutely yes. But we have to be fair, with all due respect. What is President Abbas's negotiation position on borders? His position is that he will and does recognize the state of Israel within the 1967 lines. And in fact, in the last round of negotiations under President Bush, and again, yet again, he offered a plan which gave Israel, of course, all of the 67 Israel, plus roughly 2% of the West Bank. So while you and I may not think that sufficiently incorporates enough of the settlement blocks into the state of Israel in terms of their internationally recognized borders, it's not fair to say that President Abbas has not recognized Israel's right to exist. He has. The question is, will he also deny, in effect, or give up the right of return? Yeah. And that needs to be done in the context of a full agreement. And in fairness to him, he had an interview not too long ago. President Abbas was born in Sfat, in the Israeli holy city, the Jewish holy city of Sfat. And he was asked, do you expect to go back to Sfat? And if you do, under what terms? And he said, yes, I hope to go back. But I know I'll go back as a tourist. I'm not going back to my home. Now, the next day, there were all kinds of protests in the Palestinian Authority calling him a traitor.
Right, and those people who were doing that were not in favor of peace with Israel. The point is, the right of return is a recognition of the right of Israel to exist. And until that right of return, that concept, well, yes, we'll have an agreement, and then we'll have 3 million or 4 million more of our people come within those borders. That is not a recognition of Israel. And again, I'm hoping that someday you can have a Palestine and an Israel living side by side. And when you say, and when they do say a Jewish state of Israel, let's remember that all throughout the Middle East, you've got the Islamic state of so-and-so, and that doesn't mean their rights of minorities aren't going to be protected in Israel. We all know that. When Israel says it's going to be a Jewish state, they're going to respect the rights of Muslims and respect the rights of Christians as well. We know that. But again, my time is of questions. I've got 30 seconds left. Well, like the other panelist, am I just off base in saying, until they say the right of return is gone, that they really have not recognized Israel?
beat you to it. Look, I would just add this, Congressman Rohrabacher. I think actually one of the biggest challenges we have right now is through the UNRWA program, the United Nations program that's designed to help Palestinian refugees. What they have effectively done is they have perpetuated the refugee problem. They've continued this so-called right of return challenge that we continue to face on the Palestinian side. In other words, what you had after 1948 was a situation where there were 800,000 refugees. Today, thanks to the laws in place by UNRWA, there are more than 5 million. Now, how is it that over the years these refugees have grown in number? This is an impossible number to assimilate, and so this is part of the problem that needs to be solved. I should note that there is legislation that has been slowly winding its way through the Senate, and I think also in the House, if I'm not mistaken, that looks at redefining what a Palestinian refugee is. It should no longer be okay to have the descendants of refugees. In other words, the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. That's how you get to 5 million. And those people should not have refugee status. They need to relinquish that. And only the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, can only, I think that is only a message that can come from them. And that's how this is going to begin to change. Until then, you're going to have this tinderbox that you described.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for having today's hearing. I want to welcome our colleague Bob Wexler back. I share the concerns expressed by my colleagues as well as by supporters of both Israel and the Palestinian people over the recent breakdown in the 9-month-old talks which had been brokered by the United States. It's disappointing to see the dissolution or seeming dissolution of this latest effort to achieve progress in a peaceful resolution of a long-standing conflict. Achieving a true two-state solution is in the best interests of both the Israeli and Palestinian peoples, and it is central to U.S. efforts to restore stability in the region. While there's been no shortage of finger-pointing, it appears that collective actions of both sides perhaps contributed to the erosion of any immediate chance to extend the talks further. Some characterize the Palestinian Authority's resumption of activities to accede to 15 multilateral treaties and conventions, which it had initially agreed to suspend in the midst of the peace talks, and then to announce a unity agreement with Hamas, designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, and as Mr. Wexler said, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and its refusal to recognize Israel's legitimacy clearly undermined the chance for real progress, at least for now. On the other side, some point to Israel's delay of the fourth release of Palestinian prisoners, the final group of 104, who Israel agreed to release in exchange for Palestine suspending its international recognition efforts, and Israel's continued settlement activities as also undercutting the process. Knowing how such actions from both sides would be negatively perceived by the other, I'm going to be very curious as to the panel's views on whether the U.S. did all it could to manage the process. And I have a full statement I'd put into the record with unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman.
Will be so put in the record.
I thank you. And I'd like to give the opportunity to the panel on that last question, not for the purpose of finger-pointing or blame, but what coulda, shoulda the United States done differently or in addition or more of or less of that might have made a difference? Dr. Schanzer.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly. I think that there's a lot of finger-pointing that's going on right now, and I think you're right to try to stay away from that. I think it is instructive to look at the United States and its strategy in peacemaking. And I included this in my written remarks as well as my spoken remarks. I think that the Iran issue casts a pall over the entire Middle East right now. It is the #1 challenge, and I think that, but I should even note that it's not the only challenge. You've got a civil war in Syria. You've got a very unstable Egypt. You've got Arab Spring issues. There are only so many issues that we can solve. And I say that as the United States appears to be retreating from the Middle East, not looking to engage even more. And so how we decided that we would be able to take on all of these issues and do them successfully is still very unclear to me. My approach would have been to be somewhat more modest with the objectives, to have a quiet approach to diplomacy, not to set a 9-month window with an expiration date at the end, first proclaiming that you're going to end the conflict, will then, have to downgrade and start to talk about having a framework agreement. I think it was all ill-advised. I think we bit off more than we could chew. I think that if we do get back into the business of peacemaking, I think it needs to be done more quietly. And I suspect, by the way, it's happening right now anyway. And in the process, as both Mr. Prince and I both discussed in our testimonies, there needs to be a focus on the change in leadership inside the Palestinian Authority for a more legitimate government.
I couldn't agree with you more, everything I said. Congressman Wexler, did you want to comment? Yes. We'll come to you, I'm sorry.
First, I'll agree. There's no reason to go back and assign blame. One of the things that I think Secretary Kerry, though, did right was that he effectively kept the talks secret for a great period of time, and I think that assisted both sides. But there's a misnomer here that needs to be recognized. Secretary Kerry, President Obama, didn't drag anybody to a peace table. The Israelis and the Palestinians both wanted to be there from the beginning for separate reasons. It was in their interests. And then we became, obviously, the facilitator. But let me take up on a point that the two gentlemen raised, and that is a change of Palestinian leadership. Well, in order to have a change that I think all of us would be comfortable with, you need to have a democratic process. And we need to be pragmatic about how a democratic process comes about in the context of the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian territories. In order to hold it in the West Bank, you need Fatah to agree. In order to hold it in Gaza, you need Hamas to agree. In order to hold it in East Jerusalem, you need the Israelis to agree. Well, how are you going to get Fatah and Hamas to agree to an election unless you have a reconciliation understanding of some sort? So we just need to be honest amongst ourselves. If we're going to demand a change in leadership, and we certainly want that leadership change to be democratic, then we need to understand there needs to be some accommodation with groups that we label as a terrorist. Otherwise, you're not going to have an election. So we at least need to be honest with ourselves. And the Israelis have to agree to have it in East Jerusalem, along with the two Palestinian sides.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I wonder if you just indulge Mr. Prince an opportunity to respond. My questioning is over, and I thank both the chairman and my friend.
Gentleman will have 1 minute to respond.
I thank the chair.
Thank you, Congressman Connolly. I would agree with both the previous comments. One, there needs to be a democratic process. There needs to be elections. And two, I think we did bite off more than we can chew in the recent go-around. The basic points of a departure in a deal is that both sides feel a benefit and really want to reach the end of a deal. I would argue that President Abbas, from the start of 9 months ago, was more interested in the process than he was a final status agreement. I do believe there were modest steps that could have been taken, could have been agreed upon, that would have pushed both sides together. But President Abbas did not believe from the very beginning that he had the right or ability to reach a final status agreement, and therefore the gamemanship, not to mention the Israeli side, the gamemanship continued on. There needs to be, as Congressman Wexler mentioned, some sort of democratic process to restore some sort of unity, cohesion within the Palestinian community. Right now it's dysfunctional, and I don't believe any Palestinian leader that will emerge from the Fatah leadership will be brave enough, either from a security standpoint or a political standpoint, to reach a final status agreement.
Thank you, gentlemen. Time has expired. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. In terms of this recognizing Israel, I mean, it's crucial. Yes, I acknowledge they're willing to recognize some geographic entity called Israel, but if you don't recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, then we're not in a situation where you're going to have a long-term peaceful resolution. I mean, the whole purpose of Israel being a refuge is that it would be a Jewish state, and they have consistently refused to recognize that. And I'll give some of the witnesses a chance. I don't know if that represents the broad view of the Palestinian Arabs in the area. I certainly believe that most people in Gaza do not believe Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, but that has been the biggest roadblock. There have been opportunities to have an Arab state throughout history, and it seems like the desire to not have a Jewish state always trumped the desire to have a Palestinian state. And I don't see evidence that we've gotten beyond that. So let me ask you, Congressman Wexler, you talked about you would not move to defund it because you acknowledge Hamas as a terrorist group, but you're just not sure how this is going to shake out. And it is true in the past there have been kind of attempts at unity that have fizzled. So at what point would you be willing to pull the trigger and say that we shouldn't be rewarding this type of behavior with Hamas?
If Hamas, in fact, joins a unity government and Hamas has not, in the context of that government, accepted the 3 principles adopted by the quartet, recognize Israel's right to exist, renounce violence, and incorporate all of the agreed understandings between the sides, then the law is clear. There will not be funding. But at this point—
But that recognition, you would not require that to be recognizing Israel's a Jewish state, just recognizing—
No, there's no requirement to recognize Israel as a Jewish state in any type of understanding that has previously existed between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And we need to be, again, honest amongst ourselves. When you say recognize Israel as a Jewish state, do I recognize Israel as a Jewish state? Of course I do. It's the Jewish state. Israel's the Jewish state. But where is that state? What makes it a Jewish state? It's a Jewish state because it's a majority made up of Jewish residents. Well, is that state the 1967 lines incorporating the settlement blocks, incorporating the settlements? Or is it the 67 lines plus the West Bank and Gaza? So we need to be honest. When you talk about recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, which I am all in favor of, don't get me wrong, it's not so simple on the other side. And I think we ought to take a look at the language of the Arab Peace Initiative, which is quite forthcoming. While it doesn't say Israel is a Jewish state, and it doesn't talk directly about the right of return, what it says is the right of return will have an agreed-upon resolution. Every Arab country in the world has put that forward. When they say agreed-upon resolution, that means Israel must agree. Well, they know Israel will never agree to take back 5 million refugees or even 800,000 refugees. So there has been movement.
So, and let me go to the Dr. Shanzer. What is your view? I mean, do you think, one, that moving to defund the aid if this unity movement continues, and do you think people in Congress should be conditioning tax dollars? I mean, should we demand that there be a recognition that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, given that that seems to be a precondition, certainly for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I know many of us in this body?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Look, I would say that the difference between a Jewish state and just a state that deserves to exist, in my mind, there's really no difference. And my problem has always been with the Palestinian nationalist movement that it has been more based on the destruction of the state of Israel than the creation of something, i.e. a Palestinian state. We know more about what they don't like and how angry they are than about what it is that they want to create. And so that's been my approach to this problem all along. Would it help if the Palestinians acknowledge that and put the Israelis' minds at ease? Absolutely. Should it be one of our preconditions? Look, I'll leave that to you. But let me just answer just to one thing that Congressman Wexler said. The idea of acknowledging a technocratic government that includes figures approved by Hamas is a slippery slope. The idea that you could allow this technocratic government to take place just because you want to see elections happen, that is basically acknowledging Hamas, and it is opening the door to allow Hamas to come in as a legitimate player in the next elections, which is something that we have to avoid at all costs.
And Mr. Prince?
I would definitely agree that the distinction between recognition of a Jewish state and recognizing the existence and the independence of the state of Israel is very nuanced and something that I think shouldn't preclude the United States from enforcing the law right now. Privately, the Palestinians do, and including in Gaza, they do not talk about the right of return. As Congressman Wexler says, it's sort of pie in the sky to say that Israel is going to accept millions of refugees. And they also talk about Israel as a Jewish state in Gaza City as well as Ramallah. What they don't say so is publicly. The leadership and the Palestinian papers that were released a few years ago by Al Jazeera also reinforced this concept. We're talking about the Palestinian community as a unified group, and that doesn't exist today. The right of return and recognizing Israel, I would argue, is a non-issue privately. No Palestinian leadership worth his salt on any side really says that those issues still exist today as
I
negotiated.
thank the gentleman. My time has expired, so I thank that, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you to the witnesses for being here. Congressman Wexler, with all due respect, I think Israel was created as a Jewish state. We celebrated the 66th anniversary of its creation this past Monday. It had its foundation in November 29th, 1947 in UN Resolution 181, a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews accepted that, the Arabs did not, and that's the battle that's being fought today. So I think the question really is, when will the Palestinians not recognize but accept that Israel is a Jewish state and accept that the right of return is a non-starter, as was discussed. I think it's also important to emphasize that, as you said, Dr. Schanzer, any PA reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas that includes a Hamas that doesn't recognize the quartet conditions, the three conditions as you noted, is unacceptable and cannot continue to have U.S. support. But the purpose of this meeting is really about what's next. It was in the title, and I'd like to focus on what's next. A year ago, exactly a year ago, Salam Fayyad stepped down as prime minister. For many years, I think the conversations in this committee around the country were that the future prospects for a Palestinian state depended on the aspirations of Fayyad of building the institutions. He's no longer there. He was forced out. Hamdallah was put in replacement for Fayyad, and we don't hear about him at all. What does the future of a Palestinian Authority, Palestinian government look like without people committed to building the institutions, and who might there be that would build those institutions? Dr. Schanzer?
Thank you, Congressman Schneider. I would just concur that we have a real problem, that the exit of Fayyad, look, in many ways, this was the deflation of the Palestinian nationalist project, at least one that had a direction and a vision. The defeat of Fayyad was a victory for the corruption and the ossified approach to government that Mr. Abbas has embraced over these years. Rami Hamdallah, the new prime minister, is a neophyte and really does not serve in that role of checks and balances against the presidency, which was always the intended role of the prime minister, was to check that absolute power over the Palestinian presidency. And on top of that, what we have is a very troubling development where the new deputy prime minister, Mohammed Mustafa, who also happens to be the head of the PIF, has become a very powerful guy. You see this centralization of power again, and that is the concern. The other concern is that there is just no political space for new parties, new figures to emerge. And so you have this monopoly over power without even allowing for new voices to come onto the scene, to debate, to get into that clash of ideas that is so necessary for democratic reform. And so we've got a real problem on our hands. And I have to say that American policy has reinforced this, that we continue to look at Mr. Abbas as the only one who can deliver, and therefore continue to give him whatever he needs. And so it has compounded these problems over time. When Abbas goes, there is no plan for what happens next. There is no leadership. There is no succession. It's going to be a vacuum, and it will be on our heads for failing to have planned for that moment.
Mr. Prince, I'll turn to you, but let me just interject. Dr. Schanzer talked about Mr. Mustafa rising, and I think that was somewhat predictable. Mustafa was the first choice, but I think because of his engagement with PIF, he was not palatable, if you will. So Hamdallah kind of fills the titular role, but it's Mustafa has the power. Now we're looking forward. Abbas is 79 years old. There needs to be some commitment from the Israelis to move forward towards peace, that they're going to have a partner on the other side who will be there for long term. What are the prospects? And Mr. Prince, Congressman Wexler, I'd like both your comments.
Well, first of all, as members of the committee noted, there's a significant constituency that remains for peace in both West Bank and Gaza. The problem is they're not currently represented. With Abbas leaving office prior to the next election, there will be a significant vacuum. There will be infighting and there will be debate between the older generation and the newer generation. The question is whether the newer generation, as Dr. Shanzer mentioned, has the political space to actually represent themselves and be part of the process. I believe that that's something that we should start preparing for now. If we don't, there will be a resumption of not only infighting, but probably some of the violence that happened in 2007 in Gaza will definitely go to the West Bank. There's not going to be an old PLO Tunisian, they call them the Abus, that are going to run the Palestinian Authority in the next time around. To be a partner for peace, we need to look to this peace constituency and the vast population.
If I may give Congressman Wexler a minute.
Yep.
Another aspect of what Secretary Kerry, of course, was attempting to do is, while economics are not a replacement for political achievements, a very important part of his diplomatic initiative was attracting investment to the West Bank. And in fact, extraordinary commitments were made, mostly by American, but also by some European companies, to engage in the West Bank. If you go to Ramallah today, if you go to Jenin today, if you go to other population centers today in the West Bank, they are by and large far more law-abiding, peaceful, and successful than they were, say, 10 years ago. What I think needs to happen in the future, Israel thankfully has had some extraordinary energy finds. Those energy finds, particularly in certain areas, ought to be talked about in terms of sharing with the Palestinians. You're going to need to build a port, an air facility, to allow transport in and out of an emerging Palestinian economy. But these things are very difficult to do when the Palestinians don't have their own government in effect to exercise the authority to do it. And if I may just respond to Mr. Schneider respectfully, I would be careful when referring to the UN partition plan in support of Israel as a Jewish state. Again, you consider Israel a Jewish state. I consider Israel a Jewish state. But the Jewish state of Israel that was created in the United Nations partition plan in terms of the boundaries is not a boundaries plan that Israel would accept today, and you wouldn't and I wouldn't. So we have to be careful in terms of, I would respectfully suggest, when we're talking about what is a Jewish state, it's not so simple.
I appreciate that, but when David Ben-Gurion declared independence on May 14th, he declared the Jewish state of Israel.
Yes.
And it has stayed that, it will remain that, and any negotiated peace between the Palestinians must ensure that. Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for your testimony. Mr. Shanzer, I want to go to you. I saw, I guess, a reaction to Mr. Wexler's response just in your face, so I'd give you a few minutes to respond.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman Meadows. Look, I would just say this to Congressman Wexler. The idea of ensuring continued financial assistance or financial incentives to the Palestinian Authority right now is putting the cart before the horse. Without the reform that is necessary, the $4 billion that the United States promised the Palestinians should an agreement be struck would have been wasted. In many ways, this was actually a helpful step by not allowing the peace process to go through before the reform process could take place. It would have been a sinkhole. We've seen what's happened before, where hundreds of millions, in fact, billions of dollars have been plowed into the Palestinian Authority over the last 20 years. Since 1994, we have provided billions of dollars. The Europeans have provided billions of dollars. The Arab Gulf states have provided billions of dollars. And we do not see a Palestinian Authority that is in much better shape today to perform the tasks of governance in a way that they would be respected in the Palestinian Authority or internationally. And so again, this underscores the same problem that I have been focusing on here at this subcommittee, at the committee level as well, that there is a huge problem of legitimacy, a huge problem of corruption inside the Palestinian Authority that must be tackled if we're going to be able to move forward.
All right, let me go a little bit further because I just returned from the region, and three things concern me greatly. One, we continue to spend money, and it is a complex situation. Everybody knows that. If it was easy, it would have been solved long ago. However, I went into a terror tunnel that had just been constructed with monies that we probably sent to folks in Gaza, 1.5 miles long, concrete floors, concrete walls, concrete ceilings, communication, rail, lights. And yet, here we are, we're talking about economic development, and yet this 1.5 mile long tunnel, probably built with American taxpayers' money, with the sole purpose of coming up in the middle of a field so they could abduct Jewish settlers at not settlers, Jewish folks in a kibbutz, troubled me. At what point do we say enough is enough?
Well, Congressman Meadows, I would just add this, that the money has been cut off largely to the Palestinian territory of Gaza. We've done a pretty good job of bottling that up. There are some things, and actually Mr. Prince can speak to this, where there's money that's been going through to the power plant inside the Gaza Strip that's coming from the Palestinian Authority, which of course we fund.
Right.
And so there are some millions of dollars that are still leaking through. There's also the pressure that's placed on the Israelis to ensure that the cement and other goods get through to the Gaza Strip, and if it doesn't, then of course the Israelis get blamed for a humanitarian.
But therein is the thing. It's cement that we're getting there, and it's being built in tunnels to come back at the very people who are providing it.
That's right. That's right. But I would actually just add one more thought, and that is that the top sponsors of Hamas right now are 2 U.S. allies, and this needs to be addressed. You have Qatar and Turkey. They are now the 2 top sponsors and financiers of the Hamas organization. These are not allies any longer if this is what they're doing, and we have yet to address that. I think it is a serious problem.
So, Mr. Prince, you would agree we need to address that in terms of Qatar and Turkey?
I agree. I think Qatar is one of the most pressing issues today. I happened to be in Gaza when the royal family visited some time ago. With the changing relationship with the Egyptian government, Qatar remains, and to a lesser extent Iranian money, Qatar remains the largest financier of society in Gaza. I would, just to go back to the question of tunnels and economic development or assistance. Cutting off U.S. assistance leads people to increased dependency. We have a humanitarian issue, and we end up spending money in many different ways indirectly. The question of the large economic development program proposed by Secretary Kerry, I don't believe, as Dr. Shanzer said, would have a positive impact on Palestinian society. From an economic development standpoint, I spent years going through almost every commercial enterprise in West Bank and Gaza. The region can't absorb that amount of money. Large infrastructure projects, like Congressman Wexler mentioned, look nice. They help the leadership, but they are not filtering down to providing durable jobs to local Palestinians. And until we focus on that, we're not going to solve the problem. So the question of assistance is not cutting it off, but doing it smarter.
Okay, and my time has expired, so I'd ask for the record if you would respond in writing in terms of what can we do about the incitement that is going on each and every day within that group, because it's hard to get a negotiated deal when you're adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to thank the witnesses, and in particular, I want to thank Congressman Wexler. Thank you for being here, and in particular, I'd like to thank you for the quote of Pope Francis. I'm a former Jesuit myself, and the notion that the realistic is the divine intervention, I like that. It's probably true. The miraculous would be the voluntary agreement. And you've been somewhat of a stickler here for detail, so I'm going to be a little bit of a stickler with you, if you don't mind. You've been using the date 1967 and 67 interchangeably. It's not. Israel is one of the few nations where both of those dates make sense. You can talk about the Israel of 1967, and you can talk about the Israel of 67. Israel of 67 is much, much, much larger. Remember, it was a country in 67, so you do have to be careful when you use it. I hear the President and others talking about the 67 lines. Well, the 67 lines would really tick off the neighbors, because that would be a very, very large Israel today, the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. But anyway, all that aside, I do want to talk about this within the context of Iran, because you know, to me, it almost seems trite that we're arguing about this. The reality is that Israel can take care of itself, and interestingly, Israel can also secure the Palestinians. One of the things that people don't talk about, but, you know, a lot of the Palestinians have it pretty darn good because Israel supported them. You don't think that they would need to be protected from their neighbors. Just ask Syrians. You know, how do you do out there by yourself? You know, it's a pretty mean neighborhood. So we're trying to get to a peace, and you say it's in the interest of both, but it almost seems trite within the context of this existential threat that Iran poses to Israel and ultimately the threat it poses to ourselves. Would you comment on that, Congressman, in particular?
The threat of a nuclear armed Iran is in and of itself, in my humble estimation, the most important endeavor that we must seek to defeat. And while, yes, in any sense of reality, an Israeli prime minister, as would an American president, in the context of a region, must consider all of these facts. But we have been very careful. When I say we, I think most of us on the American side that hold Israel's security very dear, we have been very careful never to mix the two. The fact of the matter is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the resolution of that conflict is in the interests of both the Israelis and the Palestinians and on the merits of the conflict itself. Because if we've learned anything from the Arab Spring, it should be that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the cause of all the root of evil in the region. It is one distinct set of circumstances that respectfully should be handled on its own, based on its own merits. Now, in reality, an Israeli prime minister certainly will consider the range of options in terms of what progress or non-progress is made with Iran. Clearly, that is the case. And unfortunately, it seems we were unable to make great progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front prior to the culmination or the non-culmination of the talks with Iran. But I think it would be a mistake if we join the two together, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Iranian nuclear program, in a way in which both had to be dealt with in some type of simultaneous or comparable way. I don't think that would benefit either the Israelis or the Palestinians.
Dr. Chancellor?
Thank you. I would just respond in this way, that the United States has had the ability to impose its will on the Israelis and Palestinians only at times when it has been able to demonstrate strength. I think about the aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War and how at that point the United States looked invincible. And it was at that point also that the Arab states, the Palestinians and Israelis, got in line and began to work through this, what's now known as the Oslo process. We have a problem now that we look weaker than we have in recent memory. We do not appear to be able to have our way with really, I mean, you think about the Iraq War, you think about Afghanistan, the war on terror. We've not enforced our own red lines in Syria. We can't seem to be able to solve this Iranian problem. We have a credibility problem right now. We need some wins. My sincere belief is that if we begin to take care of some of these problems, look, whether it's the Iran problem, whether it's the Syria problem, whether it's bringing some order back to the Arab world after the Arab Spring, whatever it is, if we begin to do that, I believe it will become that much easier to start to get the Palestinians and Israelis to take this peace process seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. I apologize. My time has expired, but I was going to go to you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here. Let me start with the money that we've invested in the Palestinian Authority since 1988, roughly $5 billion. Last year, approximately $500 million was giving to the Palestinian Authority in the name of peace, is what I like to think. You know, the people back home don't want us to give us any money overseas, especially in this economic crisis that we're having here. Yet in this room, about a month ago, in this very room, sitting right where you guys are, there was a gentleman talking about Resolution 21 and 23 in the Palestinian Authority loosely knit government laws that pays criminals that have created crimes of terrorism against American and Israeli citizens that are sitting in Israeli prisons the larger the act of terrorism, the larger the stipend they get. I think the average was $3,600. I've heard rumors of up to $10,000 a month, when the average income in that area is around $5,000. So we put in a resolution that says all funding to the Palestinian Authority gets cut until they remove Resolution 21 and 23. Starting with you, Dr. Shanzer, I'd like to hear your thoughts, and Mr. Prince and Congressman Wexler. What effect would that have?
The cutting of funding?
To stop it. If we're doing this, giving this money in the name of peace, and they're promoting terrorism, you know, if you steal a loaf of bread, you go to prison. But if you commit a crime of terrorism and kill somebody, you go to prison and get a check. And I think that's just reprehensible that the American taxpayers are flipping a bill. And I know it goes into a fungible pot, and they say, we're not using your money. I don't buy it. If you want our money, you need to stop promoting that kind of activity.
Congressman Yoho, you're absolutely correct. Here's the problem. There are a couple of problems here. Number one, what Mr. Abbas has done is he has actually delivered on peace. In other words, he brought an end to the Intifada of 2005. From 2000 to 2005, there was violence raging everywhere, and he was the leader. After Yasser Arafat died, he was able to bring all of those different militias under the control of the Palestinian Authority. He made sure to disarm them, and so in that sense, the Israelis are much happier with his leadership, and as are we, I think. Generally speaking. The problem is that even though he's brought an end to the violence, he has maintained a culture of violence nevertheless. And so that means paying off the terrorists who are in jail. It means the incitement that we see in mosque sermons and on television. And so there is a baseline of hatred that Mahmoud Abbas has maintained, and we have, to a certain extent, underwritten this. The problem now moving forward is, what do you do about it? If we zero out Palestinian funding, then here's the big problem. You're going to have someone else come in, and they're going to be worse. More than likely, you're going to see the Saudis, the Iranians, the Qataris, the Turks. They're all going to come in, and they're not even going to hold the Palestinians to account at all. The important thing from my perspective is, if we're going to keep the funding going, we need to make sure that we have tighter controls. We need to demand performance, and in my opinion, we've just simply failed to do so.
Mr. Prince?
I would definitely agree. The issue of prisoners is extremely dicey. Mahmoud Abbas has basically guaranteed security through the old-time mafia type of way of delivering brown bags and cash to people, and that includes families of political prisoners.
Right, we've read about those.
And that has continued today. At least Arafat demanded something in return. Mahmoud Abbas, usually it's just to support acquiescence to his leadership. A wholesale cutoff, as Dr. Shanzer said, presents a wide variety of problems. It's diminished leverage, it leaves a void. The degree of dependency right now on international assistance doesn't really allow for a wholesale cutoff, because aid agencies or extremist groups will come in to serve them. I would argue, though, that there are a significant amount of conditions we should be putting on aid so that it is not fungible.
I agree, and I think get rid of Resolution 21 and 23, and we'll get along fine. But until you stop promoting terrorism, I don't see how you're going to get peace. And you had touched on something else, and I think you're right on. Is we see a weakened America, and we see an emboldened other part of the world, and they're stepping up. And what effect do you think of the Iran negotiations over the nuclear weapons, and right where we're at right now? What effect does that have on the security of the Israel-Palestinian area? Go ahead, Congressman Wexler. You hadn't had a chance.
Gentleman's time's expired. We'll
I'm sorry, my time's
expired.
We'll
go ahead and take 30 seconds.
Well, first, I would agree that no American taxpayer money should be going to fund terrorist families directly or indirectly. And any way in which you can go about to prevent that is an admirable attempt. But I would also respectfully suggest you vote for this. I don't want to mischaracterize you. You say you vote for this because you're about achieving peace. Well, I would suggest it really should be more than just peace at this point. It should be peace, and when not peace, at least security. And we need to be realistic. that there are forces within the Palestinian society that in fact support violence in a very overt way, and there are those that oppose it in an overt way. And those that oppose it are not necessarily Boy Scouts, and they're not necessarily people you and I would vote for, but they oppose violence. And that's what President Abbas has done. And so when given the choice of the two teams that unfortunately we have at this point, if there becomes a third team or a fourth, then let's go for it. But now we've got the Hamas team, and there's nothing good about that team. And then you got the Fatah team, which has all kinds of warts and all kinds of problems, but they oppose violence.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Meng, for 5 minutes.
Thank you to our speakers for being here, and to Congressman Wexler. It's an honor to hear from all of you. While we're on the topic of aid, U.S. aid, I'm just curious, how much are the Palestinian people aware of the aid that the United States gives them and how much we give them? Anyone can answer.
Congresswoman Meng, they are very aware, and they're also very aware of how little of it trickles down to them. And that is ultimately, I think, one of the greatest challenges that we face. So here you have a Palestinian leadership that has brought in this $5 billion that we've heard about throughout the afternoon. There's been a significant investment on the part of the Europeans, the Arab states, et cetera, and it has been a sinkhole. The middle class has not found a way to benefit from it. The lower class has been kept in the refugee camps and in squalor. And so the problem is creating a system whereby these funds can actually find their way to the right people. And under this leadership, Congressman Wexler mentioned that, that the Fatah faction has warts. That's an understatement. In other words, as long as the Fatah faction holds sway, they are going to withhold these funds. They're going to prevent these funds from reaching the middle and lower classes, and that in turn perpetuates conflict. That is something that needs to stop. And again, that is all about leadership. It's about preparing for that next generation of Palestinian leaders. We should be making sure that they have the oxygen, the ability now to present their ideas, and that's something that we have failed to deliver on for the Palestinian people. And it's for that reason that despite the billions of dollars that we've provided to the Palestinians, they still resent us. They think that we're on the side of Abbas.
If I may, Congresswoman Meng, I agree wholeheartedly. Every Palestinian is aware of the assistance provided to by the United States, whether it's direct, indirect, through the United Nations or any other agency. The question of whether it's viewed positively, and that is something that you can trace back from the inception of the PA, that the general population has viewed these assistance programs less and less positively since the time of Arafat. If you go back to the 2006 elections, which Hamas emerged victoriously, there was a USAID program to announce new projects very close during the campaign period, close to the elections. It was a relatively thinly veiled attempt to inform the voters of the value of the assistance and the relationship with the United States. You could track the polls when those programs were announced, the decrease in support for Mahmoud Abbas and old-time Fatah. The belief is that our assistance programs on security, environmental, and health are essential, critical, useful. Our assistance on democracy and governance and economic development has largely been siphoned off or used to support the powers that be and have not filtered down to the local population.
If I may?
Sure.
Secretary Kerry's approach, the diplomatic effort that he just led, was a multifaceted approach. He took on the political issues, he took on the diplomatic-related political issues, he took on the economic issues, and he took on civil society, often in partnership with our European allies. And under ideal circumstances, you address every aspect of Palestinian Authority simultaneously to build the kind of society that we've been talking about. The problem is, at least for the time being, that is broken down. So the question is, how can you salvage as much positive results as humanly possible? And the reality is, unfortunately, that Hamas plays a role within Gaza that is completely unacceptable to us, to the Europeans, and of course to the Israelis, and in many respects unacceptable to President Abbas himself. So the question is, how do we devise a strategy where we get to the point, the type of accountability that these gentlemen rightfully are highlighting? And unfortunately, it's very difficult to do in a non-democratic atmosphere.
Thank you. What steps has President Abbas taken over the past 9 months to prepare the Palestinian people for peace? And how much support is there amongst his people for a peace deal?
The gentleman's time's expired. I know he just called the vote, so I'm gonna recognize. No, we're gonna continue, but I want to make sure. I don't think we'll reconvene after the votes. No, I think votes are in 15 minutes. Oh, okay. So I'll recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Dr. Schanzer, I noticed that you were shaking your head in apparent disagreement with Mr. Wexler's comments on Secretary Kerry's actions. Do you care to elaborate on your head shaking?
Apparently, I've been somewhat expressive this afternoon. Thank you, Congressman Cotton. Look, this is where I would disagree, is that I don't believe that Secretary Kerry's approach was multifaceted. I think that Secretary Kerry, while I believe that he was absolutely earnest in his attempts at peacemaking, fell into a familiar trap. I recently wrote a book where I went around and I interviewed former peacemakers, from Dennis Ross to Aaron David Miller to Elliot Abrams, and they all basically said the same thing, and I believe we saw a reprise of that with Secretary Kerry, and that is the emphasis of the transaction over the transformation. What do I mean by that? We continue to aim for that handshake on the White House lawn, right? You think about these grand, maybe winning that Nobel Prize, redrawing the map, and in the process, you don't get down to that less than sexy approach of state building on the Palestinian side. We continue to ignore the fact that these are basically autocrats, that these are kleptocrats. And look, I mean, if you really think that this was a multifaceted approach, ask yourself, why was it that we didn't talk about preparing for new elections? Why was it that we didn't talk about preparing for the exit of Mahmoud Abbas, who's now so many years past the end of his term? I mean, we pinned our hopes on one guy who had already passed his expiration date. That is not about reform. It's not about state building. And so we ignored the transformation again in order to get that transaction done. We need to learn how to walk and chew gum, and I don't believe that this administration did that this time around.
If I may.
Yes, you may.
Secretary Kerry didn't talk about a full-fledged election because in order to have a full-fledged election in the Palestinian territories, you need to have Hamas's agreement. And we don't deal, rightfully so, with Hamas. Now, we could redo or attempt to try to redo what was done, and I do not say this in a critical fashion towards President Bush, but President Abbas came to President Bush first time around and said, should I include Hamas in the election? And President Bush, for all the right reasons, I'm not criticizing, said, yeah, go out and beat them. That's the best way to get this scenario in order. Well, lo and behold, probably because the people felt Fatah was corrupt and a whole lot of misdirection on politics and so forth, Hamas beat Fatah. But to criticize the United States for not pushing an election in the Palestinian authorities when half of the Palestinian territory is controlled by a terrorist organization, I think is somewhat duplicitous.
Mr. Wexler, we didn't have the opportunity to overlap. I know your record on these issues, though, is long and distinguished. Can we talk briefly about more fundamental matters? It seems to me, as I've observed for years, first as a civilian, then a soldier, now a member of Congress, that the fundamental problem is Palestinian rejectionism. Why is it that Mr. Abbas and Palestinian leadership can't recognize Israel as a Jewish state, in your opinion? Why can't they give up the right to return? You have a much longer professional experience with these matters and have dealt directly with many of the people involved. I'd appreciate your perspective.
What we have here is nothing less than two competing historical narratives. Two peoples, two competing historical narratives. And unfortunately, the manner in which the Palestinian side thus far, the Arab side to a large degree for many decades, essentially viewed this as a zero-sum game. If we recognize the Jewish national people's historical narrative, then our side somehow gets slighted. And until that is overcome, Prime Minister Netanyahu is right. We're not going to have full peace. That's why it's so important, I believe, for the Palestinians to recognize Israel in the context of being a Jewish state. But we also need to be fair. If you're going to do that, you got to tell them where the borders are. Where's the border? Where are the lines of that state? And we also need to be fair, and to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he has not asked for recognition of a Jewish state as a precondition. He has said that it should be a part of the complexity of a comprehensive agreement. And in that context, if you have a resolution on Jerusalem, if you have a resolution on borders, I am actually confident that the Palestinians, in theory, might be closer to that, accepting that position than they
well, I mean, the fight over narratives goes back beyond just where we are today. I mean, it was treated as great news that Mr. Abbas recognized the Holocaust to have existed, and you still have temple denialism as well. A lot of the issues you raised, though, Yasser Arafat had a chance to accept in 2000, did he not? And he declined it to Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton said that he had made Bill Clinton a failure.
You're right.
I regret that I am. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The votes have been called, but we do have time, so I will recognize my colleague from Florida, Ms. Frankel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I want to say welcome to my former colleague in the state legislature and distinguished member of this committee, Mr. Wexler, and recognize also that I have an extraordinary constituent in the audience today, who's a dear friend, remarkable patriot who served us during World War II. And he's a great American entrepreneur and an unyielding advocate for Israel, for peace. Danny Abraham, welcome to you. 2 days ago, some of our colleagues here, we went to the floor. We celebrated Israel's 66th Independence Day, its birthday, praised the relationship of the United States and Israel. And we also noted that just prior, the day prior, Israelis commemorated Memorial Day to pay tribute to the 24,000 plus Israeli men, women, children who've lost their lives to war and terror. And you know, we've been to Israel. We know it's beautiful, it's modern, and people live good lives, but Israel has never really known real, long-lasting peace. There have been intermittent wars, periods of terrorism, and so forth. So there have been a lot of questions and answers today. I'll leave you with a real softball question, because sometimes we just talk to ourselves, and for myself, and I know everyone on the panel, we are true believers in the importance of Israel as our ally and best friend in the Middle East. But I'm going to give you each an opportunity to answer the question for the American public. Why is it so important for Israel to reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians? Why is it important for our country, for the world, and of course, goes without saying, for Israel?
I'll be happy to start quickly. If you're a Zionist and you believe in the Zionist dream, then Israel needs to figure out a way to separate from the 4 to 5 million Palestinians that live on the West Bank and Gaza. If Israel is to remain a Jewish and democratic state, a secure Jewish and democratic state, it's got to figure out a way to separate from the Palestinian people. And the only way to separate, ultimately, that ensures Israel's security is a viable Palestinian state, demilitarized Palestinian state, that is independent and can go on its own. And in terms of the Palestinians, which is not the purpose of your question, though, for those of us who are Zionists, we must be very careful to recognize also that the Palestinian people have their legitimate rights and also have a historical narrative. And to not do so I believe, in many ways, morally and ethically, is not consistent with Zionism.
I would agree with Congressman Wexler's eloquent presentation of why we need to solve this problem. But we do have to take into account that negotiations don't occur in a vacuum. The equation has to include the Palestinian people, not only their national aspirations, not only the aspirations of the Palestinians in the diaspora and around the world, but also in the West Bank and Gaza. If you walk in to a coffee shop anywhere in the West Bank or in Gaza, Palestinians will talk about national aspirations, but then they'll spend 30 minutes talking about how their day-to-day life and the troubles, feeding their family, getting a job, getting the sewage out of their house, getting medical treatment, getting antibiotics, getting adequate care, sending their kids abroad for college. If there's one thing that the Arab Spring has taught us, is that we cannot support dictators in the absence of popular support. And the Palestinian people did not support this negotiation. Not that there wasn't a constituency for peace, but they wanted to clean up their house first and show that there's benefits of peace to the community at large before reaching a final status agreement.
I'll keep my response short. I think, look, Israel promotes American principles and interests in the Middle East. It must have the peace and security that it needs in order to do so. That is in our interest as well as theirs.
Thank you very much, and I yield back my time.
Thank the gentlewoman and thank the witnesses. I really appreciate your time, and your comments and testimony are very well received by the members. So thank you so much, and this hearing stands adjourned.